Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Database Threats, Preventing the Unthinkable with Zero Trust Data Security. This event is presented in partnership with our friends over at Rubrik. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today. We've got a fascinating presentation coming up here from our Rubrik expert, and I'm excited to be hosting him today. I'll be introducing you to our presenter here in just a moment, but first, there's a few things that you should know about today's webinar. My name is David Davis, and I'll be serving as the moderator. As always, here at Actual Tech Media, we want these events to be educational. We want you to learn a lot. We want you to get your questions answered. Every IT organization out there is dealing with the onslaught of security threats and malicious attacks and ransomware. And, we need to do whatever we can do to beef up our security. And that's what this event is all about. So if you have questions along the way, we encourage your questions. We even have a best question prize I'll talk about here in just a moment. But first, I do want to encourage you to check out the questions pane there in your audience console. It's right next to the word handouts. You'll find there, many folks have already said hello, good afternoon from across the United States and around the world. So we encourage you to say hello as well. Of course, it's not required, but we love to hear from the audience. But even more importantly, if you have a question about the topic today and the Rubrik solution, that's where you should ask. We'll be taking your questions throughout the event. Experts from Rubrik are standing by. We also have a number of handouts there in the handouts tab. I want to call your attention to, there are links to the definitive guide to zero trust data security. There's a link to the 2022 Gartner Magic Quadrant. And then finally, there's a link to request a demo of the Rubrik solution. Oh, one more as well, the self-guided product tours of Rubrik. So make sure that you check those out. That's a great way to see the Rubrik solution in action. And then if you're watching this event live, we'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card at the end of the webinar today. The full price terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab as well. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing has already occurred. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our best question prize. So if you ask a question on the live event today, you'll be entered to win a $50 Amazon gift card. Prize winners will be selected and contacted after the event. And of course, you also have to meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. All right, so with that out of the way, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to today's expert presenter. Welcome to Shawn McElhinney, Solutions Architect for Oracle Database at Rubrik. It's great to have you back on, Shawn. I'll now hand it off to you. Take it away.
Thanks for the kind intro. Thank you all for attending this session. A little bit about me quick. Shawn McElhinney. I'm an Oracle Solutions Architect here at Rubrik. Been here for about 2 years. Prior to that, I spent about 20 plus years as an Oracle DBA in the industry, working on various solutions, whether as an operational DBA, development DBA, working as a consultant in both the Oracle DBA and Oracle security space. So I've been around the block and seen a lot of things, and hopefully, I'll be able to share some knowledge here, and you guys will pick up some new ideas. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. What's this session about? Well, we've got a problem that needs to be addressed. Companies really need to be able to prevent every exploit that's out there when we're looking at how to protect a solution. The trick is an attacker really only needs to be able to exploit one of those issues in order to be successful. Then we've got to look at what policies and processes and procedures should we be assessing in order to minimize that kind of exploit from happening. And then once we've identified the solutions that we can use, well, what ones should we focus on? So before we really dig in, I want to make sure that you're aware that if you have any questions at any point during the session, please drop them into the Q&A and a member of the team will be happy to answer it for you. All right, so let's dig in. So The past 2 years really have shown everyone how critical data is to business and how susceptible it is to attack. Security researchers have said for years that two types of organizations really exist. Those that have been hacked, those that don't know they've been hacked, and lately a third type's been entering the picture, which is those that are actively being hacked. So we need to realize that defense in depth really doesn't stop everything. Our technical solutions will only go so far. They're dependent on human interaction for data input, analysis, and maintenance. The fact of the matter is humans make mistakes, unless they're DBAs, because we're perfect, right? Yeah, don't we wish? So really, we got to think about how do we fix this fundamental issue. Attacks really have one common theme. They want to impact your data in some fashion, whether it be exfiltration, ransom, denying access, etc. If we want to minimize the risk, we need to move beyond that defense in depth concept and move to security at the point of data. Some of the best ways we can address this are by implementing a zero trust framework throughout the data lifecycle and implementing mitigation plans so that in the event something happens, how do we react to that? So let's talk more about this with our focus on mitigation. We'll look more at, what kind of proactive mitigation steps can we take, things we can do before an attack. Let's look at, type of insurance policies, for lack of a better term, that we should have, or that CYA kind of mitigation, and then ultimately reactive mitigation. What do we do, once we've been compromised? Let's start with the proactive mitigation and how can we prevent some of these attacks from impacting us. Proactive mitigation is really going to focus our efforts on tasks that can be done to prevent an attack from being successful. This isn't a simple activity when it comes to database threats because it spans multiple areas, like your infrastructure, your authentication processes, authorization, data lifecycle, application design and usage. All of those are potential touch points. So the question is really going to become, what should companies focus on to maximize their data security? Well, if we look at it from an infrastructure end of things, we got to consider the fact that hardware vendors update their BIOS and firmwares, and a lot of times we forget about that. These updates really contain a lot of security updates that patch really low-level exploits, and those can be of significant risk if they're not addressed. OS vendors are constantly reviewing threats against them, and they'll run red and blue team exercises to find holes and fix them. Some of them will even have ransom or bug bounties and whatnot to help get external parties testing their solutions to see if holes can be found, and then they can work on patching them to minimize the impact. With all of this information, they'll fix their OSs and release monthly or even more frequently patch updates to fix the issues. These security updates are going to be critical to keep the OS hardened against potential threats. Hypervisors are going to be another point of entry if you have a virtualized environment. They have their own operating system and applications, and they contain their own set of exploits. Think about recent exploits that have hit vCenter. Thankfully VMware got a fast workaround to that and a patch out to customers so the exploit could be closed. Then you have database platforms like SQL Server that release security updates in addition to the normal update cycle, and that'll ensure a secure platform there. Oracle does a similar thing with the quarterly CPU updates. These would be additional patches to the exploits that can be found on the OS. I'm sure some of you are thinking right now, Shawn, what the heck are you doing to me? How am I supposed to stay on top of this amount of patching? Well, Ideally, you're not an army of one. You'll typically see this type of workload broken up amongst various teams to support hardware, the OS, the hypervisor, and ultimately the database. You will likely only be responsible for the stack you support in your day-to-day. So it should just be a matter of determining the criticality of the patches needed. Fortunately, most vendors have taken the guesswork out of this by offering those monthly and quarterly patch sets. No more guessing, just apply the latest patch set. If there's the occasional 0-day that's discovered, you'll apply that one-off fix and you'll have adequate notification on it. Now the question becomes, how do you know that the person installing the updates to your stack is someone that should be doing it? That's where privileges really start, your authentication really starts to come into play. So there's several ways we can authenticate a user. At this point in time, everyone should be on or moving toward multi-factor authentication. Three primary aspects of multi-factor is something you know, whether it be a password or a PIN number, something you have, which could be your smartphone, a USB key, something that's going to give you that time-based one-time password. And then something that you are, like a fingerprint or facial recognition, gets super advanced and high-tech, and a retinal scan. One thing you shouldn't be using, because it can be easily compromised, is SMS text messages, because those can be duped, and in doing so, now your MFA is compromised. The other thing you want to look at is, how are your passwords stored? Right? You shouldn't be storing passwords anywhere in plain text. If they're in a database, hash them. Make sure that it's not readable. From a password policy perspective, we need to remember that, password length is going to be more important than password complexity. Due to password patterns that are created by users, password crackers really have adapted and can easily crack a password that is something simple like password 123 exclamation point. And even if you throw in some wildcard characters into it to substitute those for letters and numbers for letters, yeah, it's still a common pattern that can be easily identified. Really, it'd be in your best interest to try shifting to passphrases over passwords. So I'm sure many of us still remember from our mathematics lessons, the order of operations, such as PEMDAS or Please My Dear Aunt Sally. Selecting a phrase like that means something to you, and then building a passphrase from it will not only increase your ability to recall the password, but also minimizes the risk of being compromised. Another thing you can implement is breached password protection. So you can have a blacklist of already compromised passwords that exists and compare a new password that's getting generated against that list. And if it's not, if it's discovered on the list, reject it as a password so that you don't have that potential there. And when you start looking at periodic resets, the problem there becomes, oh, great, now I've got to come up with a new password. So then you're going to have somebody that's going to have a set of maybe, depending on the cycle, 4 or 5 passwords that they use everywhere. So now you're going to have that predictable pattern at play that can be easily compromised. If we start looking at tokens and certs, we don't want to hard code tokens into our applications, right? Because we should really be treating those no different than we would a password. And the tokens should be like certificates. They should expire after a certain period of time. And then we rotate those tokens on a periodic basis. If you want to get more information on some of these items, like password guidelines, access tokens, and best practices around them, we have links in the presentation that you can access some great articles on how you can actually implement those and leverage them most effectively. So if we think, now, okay, we've authenticated, so we should have carte blanche to do whatever we need to, right? Not so much. We need to really control user privileges if we want to limit the scope of damage an individual user might be able to do. So what do we really need to assess here? Well, we need to look at excessive privileges. Is the minimal permission required to do a job type of principle being done, i.e. least privilege? How many people have elevated access to the database? Is it just the people that really need it, or is it propagated far too widely? Do administrators have the ability to change data? If they do, are their activities being audited? And who has that admin or root level access, and should they really be able to have that? Then you have the concept of abusive privileges. So you have someone that has the right role, but they've decided they're going to go rogue. Or you've got a user that's changed roles in an organization, but they still have their old access. So if I'm in HR as an HR manager, but I got transferred over to finance, and I still have my HR access, well, I really don't need that right anymore in the new position, so I shouldn't have that kind of data access. And that plays into when you change roles in your company or you leave the company, your old access should be revoked. Then you have the concept of abandoned privileges, right? You've got users that are still active, maybe after the application is no longer active. Or you have users that have left the company, but their access hasn't been revoked yet. So I'm sure you got some folks here that are thinking, come on, man, I'm a DBA. My job is to keep the database online and processing data as quickly as possible. Security is somebody else's job. I got to tell you, this is really a common misconception. Security, at the end of the day, is everybody's job. As a DBA, your responsibilities essentially boil down to data. Ensuring the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of data across the entire data lifecycle is your primary objective. And it also comprises the three pillars of security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, what is the data lifecycle? If it's so important to us in maintaining security, what do we need to know about it? Here's some concepts we really need to consider as we assess some of the potential points of exposure that could result in our data being compromised in some fashion. First thing we need to know is, where does our data live? So we know we have the production system, but how many copies of the database is out there? Well, are you cloning to create QA, dev, test, etc. environments? Well, you got a copy of the data that's there. What about your backups? What's your retention period for the backups? How many of them are out there? Where do they exist? Are you keeping multiple copies of your backups on site? Are they getting shipped off to an Iron Mountain or another, backup storage vendor? If you're using the cloud, are they going to different regions that your cloud vendor provides? When you're doing, some data testing, or you may be testing a small patch or change, you might make a backup of a table. Well, how many copies of those tables are out there? I know when I'm doing it, I'll take and I'll, create table as select star from, and I'll have a date stamp along with the table name. Well, if I don't go out and clean that up, I could have 40 date stamped copies of that table. So if I've got that, how am I ensuring that no one is getting access to any one of those versions of the table? Do I know where my sensitive data is in this database? That's going to be critical when we start looking at data protection. We need to know what data needs to be protected. If I don't know my sensitive data, it kind of makes it difficult to protect it. Is some of this sensitive data getting shipped out in flat files? So, are you pulling it out to Excel so that you can do some analysis on your own, because it's going to be a lot faster than asking the IT team to generate a report for you or give you some type of matrixed access so you can do some analysis on the data? Is that secured? Probably not. And another example that drives that home is that use of spreadsheets. So I've got it all out in Excel. How is that being protected? Then we have the concept of our storage media exposure. Who has access to where the data files live on the system? Who has access to where the backups live? Does somebody have access to get in there and actually delete data or databases or the actual backups? And then who has physical access to the storage? Can somebody walk into the data center, rip out a drive and walk off with it? That's a problem. And lastly, we need to look at data placement. Are you placing internal user data near external data? So do you have the risk of, inadvertent data spills? So now I've got data that should be publicly accessible, interdispersed with data that is internal data that shouldn't be accessible. How should I architect around that? That's something you really want to think about. All of this is well and good, right? But not all data access points are going to be under the DBA's control. How are we as DBAs supposed to manage the access points we have no control over, like the applications that generate and manipulate this data that we're trying to protect? Now we can start looking at applications and how they're going to generate and access and manipulate that data set. So there's a couple things we can look at. Data masking. Our sensitive data we should be protecting by some type of row-level security. Does your database have a role that should have access to a certain type of data? If you don't have that role, then you shouldn't even know the sensitive columns exist, right? But if you do have access to the data, that is where you can supplement your security of the sensitive data by masking it, so that way the general user, or somebody shoulder surfing can't see the full data in the field. When we look at data at rest, so the data that exists in the database when we're not actively manipulating it in some way, shape, or form, should it be stored in clear text? How would you feel if, say, your credit card information, personal identifiable information, whether it be Social Security or an individual ID, was just left sitting in a database unprotected? You'd probably be a little concerned about it. So you need to be thinking about encryption for that type of sensitive data. Now we can start shifting gears toward database injection, that SQL injection attack, things of that nature. Does your application use a service account with elevated privileges to access the database? Well, in that scenario, that means that if it's using an elevated privilege account, it may have access to a whole bunch of data that you're just not realizing from the UI. And if that's compromised, it may be able to access a much larger data set than you really want that person to be able to see. Then you got to think about, is the application using procedures to access the database instead of direct queries? So if I'm using a procedural call, I've got a lot more control over what's being seen than I would if I was writing a query directly to the database from the UI. Auditing. I can't say enough about auditing. We need to make sure that usage auditing is leveraged. This will help us with our forensics if something bad really does happen. And we should really be working with the audit teams. Let's engage them and look at the careful considerations we need to make from the findings they present. I know audit tends to be a real dirty word for DBAs. I have several audit horror stories myself. But the earlier we engage the internal audit teams, the greater the chance for success when an audit actually happens. And when we actually are working with external auditors, don't be afraid to ask them questions. If there is a finding, ask them about it. Do they see this kind of problem frequently? Have they seen different ways to address it? Understanding the auditor's expectations, positions you for a much smoother audits in the future, because you can develop an understanding of the process instead of simply playing whack-a-mole with auditor findings and different CVEs that are out there. So now that we have an idea of what needs to be done to limit our attack surface, we can start to talk more about the steps we can take to ensure our downtime is limited in the event of a successful attack. So if we think about an insurance policy in its most basic form, it's designed to protect us against certain risks. Proactive mitigation is the equivalent of, say, an insurance inspector reviewing your property and telling you what you need to fix in order to maintain coverage. The real fact of the matter is someone inevitably will get hurt on your property. Your insurance policy will cover you in the event somebody falls down your stairs. But is there a critical type of insurance that every company should carry? That insurance policy really is your backup. The fact of the matter is humans aren't infallible. Right? So there's no guarantee that the steps we've discussed thus far will be properly implemented, if they've been implemented at all. So what we need to think about is focusing on that concept of a recovery strategy, not a backup strategy. What are we trying to recover from? So come up with the use cases, determine here's the type of recovery scenarios we're going to encounter and we need to be ready for. That will really tell you how you need to back up your environment. And you'll always hear from the business, and the data owners, oh, we want zero data loss. All of us know that, that's typically not a reality unless you've got unlimited funds. So we need to be able to research the options or have options in hand that state, okay, yeah, here's roughly what you're looking at for costs for zero data loss. When the business starts to see that, they may start stepping back on those requirements. If it's affordable, yeah, they may accept it and have you implement it. Fantastic. If they can't afford it, now you need to get into the discussion of, okay, how much data loss is actually acceptable? And that can be a little more difficult conversation. Based on the results of that conversation, you can start building your recovery strategy and recovery rules to ensure you hit that target. What do I need to do, for example, if I have a 15-minute recovery point objective for the critical apps in this database? Once you have the recovery strategy in place, you need to test it. All right? Does it meet the business requirement? You can't go one and done, right? A test strategy needs to be developed. Things are going to change between tests, whether it be data growth, environmental changes from patching, things of that nature. Could be a corrupted block in your database. Has the database size changed significantly that might actually hinder our ability to land a backup? Or if it's significantly larger, are we still going to be able to hit that RPO? What adjustments do we need to make to ensure that we still can? Do we pull the backup from storage where the backup lives? Let's look at hot and cool storage when we're thinking about that. Is it something that's going to be local, or is it something that I now have to get my hands on in order to get it online? And if we're looking at something like bare metal recovery, there's a lot of details that can be overlooked there. That's why testing that process can really help shake things out and nail down exactly what you need to have as part of a bare metal recovery exercise. So I bet a lot of you are thinking back to your last recovery or DR exercise, and now you're ready to hide under your desk because of the thought of performing it with some frequency is just a daunting kind of task. And really, this is an area that Rubrik can be a huge help. If we look at Rubrik's Zero Trust data security solution, it's going to enable you to have a single pane of glass for all of your database protection activities, for starters. Then you'll be able to automate that database discovery and protection process. In addition, you'll be able to significantly decrease your recovery time objectives and let the DBA stay in control of the entire recovery process. Then, to make your life easier as a DBA, you can actually simplify some of the cloning activities by enabling self-service features for specific users. Now, I mentioned automating the discovery and backup processes. Well, by doing that, the DBAs are going to be enabled to focus on what is likely the most important and nerve-wracking part of the job, that recovery concept. Pardon me for a second. Traditionally, restoring databases can be a very tedious task, right? You've got to find the files you need to recover. Then actually start reassembling the full and the incrementals and then the logs to try to get the database back to a usable state. Depending on the use case and the SLA, Rubrik can provide the DBA with a variety of options to recover, whether it be export or clone, instant recovery, production recovery, a DBA managed recovery where we simply present the files and you have at it, or the concept of a live mount. Now, live mount is what's going to make those recovery tests exponentially easier for you. Live mount is going to enable the DBA to use the compute horsepower of a host that has a set of database binaries on it, run that to execute your restore. But what Rubrik is going to do as part of the restore activity is it's actually going to remap your data file locations so that your data files are going to be presented on Rubrik storage. So you're no longer pulling all of that data either across disk or across your network to stand it back up and hydrate it back on your local host. So think about it this way. If you're running a recovery test for a 20 terabyte database, live mount can actually change that recovery time from, say, 4 to 6+ hours for the full recovery down to a matter of minutes. So imagine, if you can, automating that process with Rubrik API calls, and now, that recovery test, you're not even involved with, really, because you can just have that automated API runs the test, and you periodically go out as a DBA and check a report to confirm that the test completed successfully. If it fails, you get a notification saying, hey, this backup or this restore operation failed. And now you can go in and investigate what happened. Frees you up to do so many other activities that provide so much more value than babysitting a restore process. Now, I know we've covered quite a bit of material thus far. Let's recap. We've talked about the steps we should take to prevent an attack and the resources we need to ensure the recovery from an attack. And now we can start digging into what we should do during an attack. God willing, the Borg haven't hacked your system. The fact of the matter is a breach is going to happen. The key to minimizing the impact of the breach is how you respond to it. So we need to be thinking, what should companies and their staff do when they discover an attack? First thing is, take a step back, take a deep breath, and assess the situation before you act. Think about the following items. Okay, what are the affected assets? Do we have any analytics on the data to know what's good data and what isn't? Do we have any idea on the blast radius? What's been affected and what's the worst that could be happening? Based on that affected data, now we can start looking at our recovery steps based on the use cases we developed in the previous steps. Do we need to recover an entire VM, specific files, a database, tables, or specific records? Enter the recovery plan. We should have runbooks for all of the different recovery plans. We should have documented times for how long we think it's going to take to recover. So that way, when management is all freaking out about, how long is it going to be before this is online, you could actually have a documented number that says, well, historically it's taken, boom, 2 hours and 20 minutes to restore this database. So this is what we're shooting toward right now. And then recovery isolation. Do you have an area where you can recover data to a non-production or sandbox so that you can validate it before putting it back into the production environment, right? By isolating that, that's going to enable you to do some forensics there too, to say, okay, do we have a backup here that is free of whatever issue is causing, has caused the outage? Our recovery tools, do you have backups that you can recover from? Think about your traditional ransomware attack. What's the first thing it's doing? It's blowing away your backups so you can't recover. Then it's going to encrypt your database. Then it's going to offer a ransom note. And that's when everybody's going to start to panic because you have nothing to get back into operations. When you identify the issue, stop operational tasks against that data. You don't want that issue to proliferate across to other systems or other environments. You don't want to have your backups running during this time until you can confirm that your data is back in a good state. And the last thing you want to do is, or not do really, is delete the data. You need that data there so that you can do some forensic analysis on it. Now we can shift focus to communication and documentation. Does everybody know what the recovery options are? What is the communication plan? Who do I need to talk to as the DBA? Who should I be listening to as the DBA as part of this process? The better the process is documented, the smoother your recovery is going to go. So that type of documentation and communication plan should run from your C-suite all the way down to help desk. And really, if you think about the entire process and everything we've talked about thus far, it really sounds similar to how an elite athlete might train. Know what you need to do, work with the tools you have, and practice until it becomes muscle memory. But there's always the chance that something may go wrong with how you train, or something happens on the day of the event that went wrong. So what do? This is one of the reasons you should have a blameless postmortem after an event. Think of it as reviewing the footage from yesterday's game. Start assessing, okay, what exactly happened? What was the event? What proactive steps failed that allowed the event to happen? Did a tool fail? Did a system or procedure fail? Was there a group of them that failed? And then let's look at what worked well. if we can identify the things that are working right, well, can we scale that out? Can we automate that? What are the variants from what happened to our recovery plan? So did we have events that we hadn't documented? Do we need to adapt our recovery procedures and now our backup procedures to make sure that this can't happen in the future? This gives you an idea of really what was accounted for and what isn't, and then adapting to minimize impact in the future. Now, what was the ROI on your test plan, versus what really happened? Did the plan get you where you wanted to be, or did it fall short? So, all the time that you put into this test plan, did it do it right, or did it leave you hanging in certain areas? Then ultimately go on and say, okay, what should be changed? Was it a process failure? Do we need to go through and reassess how we do things from an execution perspective? Or was there a problem with the technology? Were we not on a latest patch set on something? Or does this piece of technology that we're using really not fulfill the need that we have? We've really covered a huge amount of information in this session. So I want to recap some of the key takeaways you should be coming away with here. The big thing is working with your organization's security team in an effort to prevent that breach. Another item is it's really not realistic to think that you're going to be able to stop every attack vector. You just need to make sure that you're protecting your critical assets and have a mechanism to return them to service quickly. Lastly, panic under stress is going to be your worst enemy. Having the plan isn't enough. You need to execute that plan regularly and revise it when you discover there's a shortcoming. That comprehensive response plan will ensure that all your participants know their role and what they need to do. Testing the plan in a controlled fashion is going to really be what enables everyone to understand what's expected of them and how they should execute under pressure. At the end of the day, we're all DBAs. We're not salespeople, right? So why not lean on somebody like a Gartner to provide you with some unbiased feedback and give you an idea on what Rubrik's bringing to the table? You'll see that there's a link here to download a complimentary copy of the latest Gartner's Magic Quadrant, where Rubrik's proud to be ranked among the leaders again, third year in a row. This year, of all the solutions evaluated, Rubrik ranked furthest to the right for completeness of vision, again. Definitely take a look at this if you haven't already. You'll also see that our database protection was actually called out as one of our core strengths. If you're interested in learning a little more about the product in detail, I strongly recommend keeping an eye out for some of our virtual events so you can actually get hands-on with the product and see it in action for yourself. We've also thrown in some additional information here on what to look for in modern data protection solutions for databases, as well as a link to guides on how to recover from ransomware if you're interested. And with that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time and joining us today to talk about different scenarios and how to protect them. If you have any questions, please feel free to fire away. Appreciate the time. Hope you enjoyed the presentation and hope to talk to you soon. Have a great day.